My name is John Dominic Crossan, and I'm a Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at DePaul University in Chicago. This is the fourth part of my academic autobiography, originally created for my website, and you may notice that the time span is 50 years, which is rather long for a very short video. However, most of the time in those 50 years was spent either teaching classes or writing books or traveling for research projects, Europe and the Middle East. And in general, you don't take any photographs inside classes, so there's none of that. And in terms of books, there is a special section in my website for the books, so I only mention the ones here that have special stories about them. And in terms of, again, the explorations, research trips for biblical sites and places, they get their own section in the website under exploration. So basically all you're going to get here is certain main points in the last 50 years. And I'm starting actually in 1969, and it goes, I'm writing this and thinking about this right now in 2025. "1969 was the year of transition, or maybe better, plural, transitions, because I was going from celibacy as a priest and a monk to marriage. I was going from teaching in the seminary to teaching in the university, and from biblical research under the protocols of ecclesiastical censorship to research under the protocols of academic scholarship. And I represent that transition by those two headshots, the one to the left in my habit as a Roman Catholic priest and monk, and then of course the one to the right as a layperson. And although the transitions really involved my whole life, it's especially in the years 1969 to 1973 that the crucial pivot of those transitions took place. Like many other priests, I had thought, maybe even expected, that the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965 would allow for a married priesthood. When it didn't, after 1965, I suppose at the back of my mind was always the thought, should I stay as a priest scholar, a celibate priest scholar? Should I leave, get married, and become a lay scholar, moving from, say, a seminary to university, and from celibacy to marriage? But when I actually did leave, that was one of the reasons I wanted to get married. But there was another one by then. I think if the church had said in 1969, we are now going to allow a married clergy, I would have left in any case, because I could no longer teach what I had been really very well taught to teach freely without discrimination or censorship by church authority. I wanted to leave to get married. I wanted to leave also to be able to say with authenticity and with veracity what I had found, what I was seeing in the Bible without any censorship. Margaret Dagenet was an artist and a professor at Loyola University in Chicago. She was in its Department of Education, and from that base in that department, she had founded the Fine Arts Department and become its first chair. On the 11th of August in 1969, Margaret and I vowed to one another, until death do us part. On the 4th of June 1983, death did. And in honor of Margaret, I would say, adapting Yeats's famous line, "We love and love what vanishes. What more is there to say. I turn now to a rather more difficult transition, one in academic scholarship and my own status as a scholar. Obviously, my difficulty was that I had been a pre-scholar. The two things had been inextricably intertwined because my superiors, religious order superiors, had decided that I would be a scholar, and I loved it, of course. In one sense, scholarship was simply a continuation of those talks with my father on the Naas Dublin Road in the 40s, actually. But how was I going to extricate priesthood from scholarship? I was very well known in the Roman Catholic tradition. I had come up with a doctorate in divinity from Ireland and had been studying with the Jesuits at the Biblical Institute in Rome and the Dominicans at the École Biblique in Jerusalem. But I really wasn't known outside the Catholic tradition. On the other hand, in the years, say between, I suppose, probably 67 on, I've been really thinking about very much parables and the historical Jesus. And when I finally left the priesthood in 69, I decided to send out an article on the parables and the historical Jesus to the three major organizations and the journals, which you can see there. The SBL is the Society of Biblical Literature, with its Journal of Biblical Literature. The Catholic Biblical Association, with its journal, the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. And then the Society of New Testament Studies. That's actually Latin, but it works in English too. And New Testament Studies. I sent them all out at the same time to see, well, they kind of say, I'm here, so there, I've arrived. There was no trouble, as you can see. The Journal of Biblical Literature accepted my article on the wicked husbandman, the parable of the wicked husbandman. It came out in 71. New Testament Studies published an even more important one on parable and example in the teaching of Jesus. That came out, I think, in 72. But the more interesting and difficult one was with the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. I sent a different article into them. It was called Mark and the Relatives of Jesus. And I sent it into the Catholic Biblical Quarterly, probably around the same time, 69 to 70. Got no reply. Waited for 6 months and called up the editor, Monsignor Rossiter, and asked him politely what had happened to my article. And he said, we rejected it, but I thought we told you. And I said, no, I have not received any rejection. What was wrong with it? And he said, well, one of the main readers said he could not possibly imagine reading his New Testament and seeing Mark opposing or criticizing the relatives of Jesus and the 12 apostles. He returned the article to me. I took it out of the envelope it came in, put it into a new envelope and sent it to the other major New Testament journal, Novum Testamentum, sent it off to them. They immediately accepted it without any comments or qualifications, and it was later reprinted in the composition of Mark's Gospel. That, quite frankly, left a very nasty taste. I considered that they had judged the article not simply in terms of scholarship, but not even in terms of orthodoxy, but in terms of likes and dislike of a major reader. So, although I was a member of the Catholic Biblical Association and have never cancelled my membership, I knew I would never submit another article to them. I couldn't trust the readership. If I was being judged by orthodoxy, then that was a different criterion. The other journals judged you only on competence and not on orthodoxy. So, basically, that left me in fairly good standing, but I still had to negotiate a little bit the transition from, say, the Catholic to the, what do I call it, the secular scholarship. In that transition, two older scholars were very, very important, and I owe them a great debt of gratitude. One was Norman Pearn at the University of Chicago. He was interested in the same general scholarly area that I was. You can look at two of his books there. The one from 1967, Rediscovering the Teaching of Jesus, so he's also interested in the historical Jesus. And then that later one from 1976, Jesus and the Language of the Kingdom. I just put those two up as representative. And Norman actually read the article on Parable and Example in the Teaching of Jesus and gave me a call. I was living in Chicago, of course, too, as he was. And in effect said to me, politely, of course, and not as bluntly, was, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" He said, "I showed that article to my seminar, told them to tell me how wrong you were, and they said you weren't wrong. You were right. So basically, can we meet?" And we got to know one another quite well. And so his support, if you notice, he was president of the SBL in 1973. So that was a very important support. And I think, there was not only a commonality between us in that we were both interested in parables as a way of working towards the historical Jesus, but in a way we both came from Europe. He had come from England, studied in Germany. I'd come from Ireland, studied in Rome and Jerusalem. Maybe we weren't properly sociologized in the American tradition. And maybe both of us had our own sort of skepticism about the consensus of scholarship and how much it forces everyone to go along with itself. So maybe we were both a little bit, I don't know if maverick is the right word, but a little skeptical about the established scholarship and how it controls everything. The other major scholar who was very important in sponsoring me and supporting me with relationship to the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, in that transition from the Catholic Biblical Association to the SBL, was Robert Funk, and we will meet him again later on. Notice he was the executive secretary of the SBL from 69 to 73 and was pulling it, I think, kicking and screaming possibly into the modern world. He was also president of the SBL in 1975. And again, like Norman Pearn, he was interested in parables as a way into understanding the historical Jesus. You can see that collection of his parables articles goes back to 1964. By 1973, therefore, and again with gratitude to Norman Pearn and Bob Funk, I felt that my scholarly status was more or less established and the transition had been safely negotiated. If you look, for example, at those images, my first scholarly book was published in 1973, and you can see the title came from, of course, all those articles I had been publishing. It was In Parables, the challenge of the historical Jesus. So again, bringing parables and the historical Jesus together. And I was often amused by that cover, because if you looked at the front of it, you thought, well, it's kind of maybe about the sower parable or something like that. But if you looked at the whole cover that wrapped all the way around the book quite beautifully, by the way, I put up in white superscript there what I think you're really seeing. You're seeing a scene from the Old Testament, from 1 Samuel, where it says the people of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley when they looked up and saw the ark they went with rejoicing to meet it. So I'm quite happy to have that Old Testament vision on my first book in parables. The second major thing was DePaul University granted me a full professorship in 1973. A lot had to do with that book. I'll talk a bit more about DePaul in a few minutes. Also, with, again, Norman Perrin and Bob Funk supporting and suggesting it, I was the chair of the Society of Biblical Literature's Parable Seminar. That means that during the annual meeting, instead of just giving papers, you could also run a seminar for maybe 4 or 5 years, and maybe 30 or 40 scholars would commit themselves to coming together, preparing papers which would not necessarily have to be read to one another as if Gutenberg had never existed, but could be sent out ahead of time and then discussed. So it put the emphasis more on discussion, what you had read together, than listening to people reading their papers to you, as I said, as if there was no printing facilities available. The other major, do I call it success, I suppose, was that the new journal Semaya, and by the way, Margaret had invented that cover, Semaya, it was called an experimental journal for biblical criticism. As you recall, the Journal of Biblical Criticism was the major one from this society, the SBL. This was kind of to do all the other things that the SBL didn't do. And the first one came out in 1974. I was its associate editor under Bob Funk, who was the main editor, from 1973 to 1981, and then I became the general editor from 81 to 86. So basically, I felt I had negotiated successfully the transition from the Catholic tradition into the more general secular tradition, and by 1973 the transition was basically complete and I was ready to continue. In 1969, during the transition period, the other major question besides my scholarly status was an academic appointment. I had taught for a year at Loyola University in Chicago when I was a priest, and they had been interested, the department head told me, in my coming there full time. So when I was leaving the priesthood, I called up the chair and said, I'm leaving the priesthood, I'm doing it by the book, I'm asking for permission, I will be getting married, are you still interested in me? And he said regretfully, no, we're not ready for an ex-priest in the Department of Theology. A similar thing had happened with Notre Dame, Indiana. I had never taught there, but I had taught a couple of summers across the road in St. Mary's and got to know many of the scholars in the Notre Dame theology department, and the chair had one time asked me would I be interested in coming full-time to Notre Dame when I was a priest. Of course, that happened. So again, I called them up when I had decided to leave, told them what was happening, and they said again, no, we're not ready for an ex-priest yet. The third one actually that I tried was DePaul, because obviously since I was married to Margaret Dagenet teaching at Loyola, I wanted to stay around Chicago. The reply I got from the president, and I asked the president whether there would be a problem having an ex-priest in the theology department, his answer was as blunt as it was honest. He said, orthodoxy is between you and your bishop, competence is between you and the university. So basically I applied to DePaul and I was accepted. So once I left, there was only about 3 or 4 months in the first months of what would be 1969 when I didn't know what was happening, when I really didn't know where I was going to be. By April of 69, I knew that fall I was going to be teaching at DePaul University, and quite frankly, I have never ever thought seriously in the next 26 years of leaving DePaul. If any other university talked to me, and some did, asked me was I interested, I said, don't waste your time on me. I am not leaving DePaul. I like DePaul for its honesty, for its integrity, and of course, yep, that was because they had accepted me, but basically because they made a clear distinction between problems of orthodoxy, which were outside the university, and problems of competence and requirements, which were inside the university. So from 1969 until I took retirement in 1995, DePaul was happily my home. Between the 1970s and the 2020s, while I was at DePaul and after my retirement from DePaul, I'm going to choose 5 projects that involved a fair amount of time. The first of those is the Jesus Seminar of the West Star Institute, and this requires a fair amount of explanation because it was extremely controversial, and in any controversy, truth is very often and accuracy often go as first victims. Let me return to Bob Funk. You remember how important he was for me as a sponsor when I was getting used to the SBL. And as executive secretary, he had invented the idea of annual meetings that would not simply be short sessions with people reading a paper to one another and discussing it, but apart from those, and along with those, there would be longer sessions, seminars, which for 5 years, say, scholars would commit themselves to focusing on a given subject, a core problem, shall we say. The papers would be prepared ahead of time, read ahead of time, and then we'd have full time for maybe an hour and a half, or even up to 3 hours of discussion at a meeting. All right. You remember that worked, for example, for the Parables seminar in which I was involved. Bob had also imagined, while he was in the SBL, doing a subsequent Jesus seminar. That was kind of obvious after the Parables seminar. But when he left the SBL to found the West Star Institute, its flagship seminar, probably inevitably, was of course the Jesus seminar, which he had already imagined. Some details about myself. Bob was the founder and the idea person behind it. He asked me would I like to be co-chair. He was the chair. I said, Bob, does that really mean I'm going to have to do administrative work? And he said, no, I just want your name as a historical Jesus scholar. And I said, fine, as long as it's no administrative work, you got my name. That was the first thing. Secondly, what I agreed absolutely with Bob was the idea that it was not ethical to do all our work, as it were, not so much in secrecy or in privacy, but in very formidable academic tomes, or journals, or meetings, or associations, which no educated layperson would probably be able to join. Even the very look of a page in a journal, half of which was footnoted, was like the ramparts of a castle to keep you away. He argued that really isn't right. We should be doing our work in public, especially in a country like America, which is sort of besotted with fundamentalism. We should do our work in public. Here's what we're doing. Know about it, like it or dislike it. I agreed absolutely with that. I thought that was an ethical demand. However we did it, it should be done in some way in public. At least our conclusions should be out there for the public to see. So, Bob proposed his Jesus seminar. But his way of doing it was, we will take, say, a saying of Jesus. Let me give an example. love your enemies. We take the most famous one. Love your enemies. We would prepare papers, whoever wanted to do it, on that, and they would decide at the end, and they would give evidence. We were completely clear that an opinion without evidence is bias, and opinion against evidence is prejudice. So you give your opinion, and you would do it in one of four categories at the end. I would consider that Jesus said this, certainly. I would judge that Jesus said this, not quite certainly. I would judge that Jesus said it, probably not, or certainly not. The obvious four categories, however you want to put them, of any judgment on anything. So, however, Bob wanted this done when you presented your paper. The seminar would vote. So let's say I presented a paper, and whatever it was about, I gave my judgment. Let me say, I think maybe Jesus said this. Then we had four categories and four colored beads to represent the categories, because if we had television cameras, we wanted them to be able to see what we were doing. So red, pink, grey, black would be the four categories. In effect, if it was black, it simply meant it stayed in, it wasn't uncolored, it stayed in the basic color of the Bible. If it was certain, it went into red, etc. You understand what I'm saying. The whole idea was to be as public as possible. That was the theory behind it, to let people see what you're doing. So we didn't have ballots, as it were, secret ballots. We dropped our colored bead into the bowl, as it were, and it voted on our security. We knew, of course, it did not establish, if we voted certainly, that established it beyond all question. It simply meant that it's different if 40 people vote yes out of 40, and it's different if 21 vote yes out of 40. So that was the Jesus seminar. And of course, the big controversy was none of that. That was just kind of shenanigans. The big controversy was we were doing it in public. We'd come out into the street and we were scaring the horses. So there was a lot of opposition, both from right wing, which didn't agree with the whole idea at all of Jesus not having said certain things attributed to him, but also left wing, of people who would agree with us, possibly, on our conclusions, but did certainly not want the controversy of doing it in public, did not want to educate the laity, in other words. You see here the three main volumes produced by the Jesus Seminar. The first phase were on the sayings of Jesus, and that ran from 85 to 91 and was published in 93. The second volume was on the acts of Jesus, the deeds of Jesus, and it ran from 91 to 96 and came out in 98. And a final, much shorter volume on various profiles of Jesus. That was the third phase, from 96 to 98, was finally published in 2002. Those were the three volumes, the products of the Jesus Seminar. The first one might require some explanation, because it says the five Gospels, and you're probably thinking of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What's the fifth one? The fifth one is the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Coptic Gospel. Coptic is the Egyptian language written with Greek letters and some extra letters as well. And it was discovered at a place called Nag Hammadi, buried at Nag Hammadi in a jar, a sealed jar, and discovered in the 1940s. So it's controversial again. Is it independent of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John Gospels, or is it simply sort of an extract from them? If it's an extract from them, it's of no profound importance. If it's independent of them, of course, it is much more important. And in general, the seminar considered it was independent of them, hence that title, The Five Gospels. My next major project focuses around the year 1991 and November of that year. As you can see, I published then the book I had been working towards ever since, I suppose, In Parables, The Challenge of the Historical Jesus in 73. This was 300 pages, a big book, The Historical Jesus, The Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant. And in one sense it's a bit of an anomaly because it wasn't written for public consumption. It was written for my historical peers, my scholarly peers, and it was basically attempting to work out a methodology, not just to talk about the historical Jesus, but to do so by creating a methodology that might give a due process possibility for various scholars who would all work on the historical Jesus from different points of view, but might agree to a certain consensus of due process, like lawyers going into a court debating fiercely with one another, but they would still have to follow the protocols of due process. In any case, that was the book. It came out in November 1991, and I was at the SBL annual convention because my publishers, Harper One, were showcasing it there. And then I went down to Doubleday and I asked, could I buy the book on the historical Jesus, also coming out at the same time by Father John Meyer of Notre Dame University. And very graciously they said, well, you're kind of the main opposition, so by all means take a copy and it's free for you. I didn't realize at the time that it was simply the first volume of what was projected maybe into 7 volumes, 5 of which had been published by the time Father Meyer died, unfortunately, and too young actually to complete his project. But in any case, there in November 1991 were 2 big books on the historical Jesus. What happened next was the sort of publicity that authors and editors and publishers can only dream about. Peter Steinfels, who was on the, shall we say, the religion desk at the New York Times, had been at the convention, so he knew about the 2 books. And I suppose because we had here 2 Catholics speaking about the historical Jesus, which was not actually a high priority at the time. One of them was a priest, and one of them was an ex-priest. Both of us had studied at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. John had his doctorate from there. I had my licentiate, my master's degree from there. I suppose I was probably considered more liberal. John was more conservative, using those terms without insult to either of us. So it was a perfect story, and it went out for the Christmas issue of the New York Times, coming out on Monday, December the 23rd, and was copied thence into all sorts of small town papers as the Christmas stories around the country. Almost immediately, my book, I don't know what happened to John's, but all of a sudden mine was selling. And you know, you can tell, to be very honest, by your royalties how many books were bought. You cannot tell from your royalties how many books were finished. And I always had a strong suspicion that that book was bought more than it was fully read. But that's just my viewpoint, because it was not intended to be a simple book intended for a lay person. It was intended really to be a methodological challenge, as I said, to my peers. But be that as it may, books have their own fates, and this book was fated to be on, according to Publishers Weekly, on the bestseller list for hardcover religious books for at least 6 months. My third example of a project concerns 2 books. The first of them you can see there is called Excavating Jesus, and it is written jointly, completely integrated between archaeology and exegesis by myself and another scholar, Jonathan Reed, who is a field archaeologist who had worked at Capernaum and at Sepphoris and was a professor at Laverne University in Los Angeles. The title tells you how we integrated archaeology and exegesis. Beneath the stones for archaeology, behind the texts for exegesis. In 1998, he had proposed to my publishers, that's Harper San Francisco, it later became Harper One, a book on Galilean archaeology and the historical Jesus. And they suggested to him, and then suggested to me, that I should write a foreword for his book, because that would give it some more publicity if my name was on the cover, to write sort of an overture. I said, no, I know exactly who Jonathan Reed is. In fact, I had read his dissertation. That was in the good old days when you had to get on-demand publishing from University Microfilms International. But I'd been fascinated by the title of his dissertation from 1994. It was called Places in Early Christianity. I put the title up there so you can read it. Galilee Archaeology, Urbanization and Q. And he was done at the Claremont Graduate School, graduating in 94. I had read the dissertation, still have it actually all marked up. And I said, what I really want to do, dear publishers, is to go and write a book with him in which he does the archaeology and I do the exegesis, and we integrate them completely together, not his little half, my little half, but everything completely integrated. And they said, okay, whatever, just get together and figure it out yourself. So I got together with Jonathan, and we agreed that the best thing to do would be, he invited me actually, would I like to come to Galilee? The dates will be the 7th to the 21st of June in 1999. We could get there when most of the digs were closed for the season, but the archaeologists were still there. He introduced me to all of those people, and we could spend a week in the Galilee and a week in Judea. And he invited me, I think it was an email, after the convention, would I like to do that? And he told me later, when we got to know one another, I thought you would say no. Instead of saying no, I jumped at it. I thought the idea of getting a graduate education from a field archaeologist, of course. I said, only one condition. Sarah's coming with me, and therefore we would like a nice car with air conditioning, and we will get the car, Jonathan, if you will drive it, because I'm too young to die on the Levantine roads. And that's what we did. So we had an absolutely marvelous week in the Galilee, a week in Judea, and then suddenly on probably the last day, we were sitting together in the beautiful garden of the Albright Institute, and we suddenly realized we hadn't even talked about the book. We'd been so enthralled by looking at everywhere and Jonathan taking us around Sepphoris and places like that, never got around to the book. So Sarah produced a piece of paper and we sketched out the chapters. For example, we said we'll do one on God's rule and Rome's rule in the Galilee. I'll do God's rule, you do, with Jesus, you do Rome's rule. And we sketched out the whole thing. And we agreed that I would edit the text and that Jonathan would edit, and that meant very often create, and the illustrations. And that's what we did. So we went off home, and John worked on his text, and I worked on my text, and we amalgamated them completely. Sometimes Jonathan would start the chapter, then I would come next, or we integrated it completely. So we wanted archaeology and exegesis dancing nicely together. And that's what we did. And it was marvelous education. Later, there was an exhibition of Balog's paintings at Laverne University, and we showed how art and archaeology and exegesis could all play happily together. I am still dealing with a third project and a second book with Jonathan and myself, but for this one we have moved from Jesus in Israel in the first century to Paul in Turkey in that same first century. Behind it actually was a facetious comment made by Jonathan's brother saying, I suppose you guys now are going to keep excavating your way through the New Testament, and you'll excavate Paul and you'll excavate Peter. And Jonathan emailed me, told me about it, and said, yeah, we should do a book about Paul. I'll work on an Aegean beach and you work in an American library. I emailed back, great idea, but if we work on Paul, does that mean I have to read him? So hold on to that for a moment. Second major backstory. Think of Ephesus, looking out as it once did, right immediately onto the Aegean, sort of mainly in a valley, going up the slopes of a mountain to its north and to its south. And imagine a sort of a cave shrine carved into the northern side of that southern mountain. It had been discovered, I think, in the 60s, and was called very often the Cave of St. Paul for no particular reason. As you will see, it could be called other things as well. But I had finally got permission to go in to see it. I'll talk a bit more about the background to this later. But a friend, Haluk Chetinkaya, a guide, had got permission to get in there along with Recep Ogsu, who was one of the Ministry of Culture, guardians or overseers, keeping an eye on the Austrian excavators there. He had got permission to get in, so I've been trying to get in for a couple of years because I'd heard about it, read about it by a Turkish journalist, but didn't have very good details about it. So I finally got in to see it. As you walk in that door on the preceding slide, you look down a long, narrow hallway with frescoes at the far end. But what I'm mainly concerned with is on your right as you enter is that picture that's given there to the left of the hallway. Now, there's also on your left as you go in, there was once, and there's now only the remnants of the sacrifice of Isaac or the non-sacrifice, I suppose you would call it, of Isaac by Abraham. But to your right is that scene, and it's quite clear what it is. The names are on there in case you don't know. On the left, looking out from her house, she is a young nubile woman, therefore she is not out on the street, as it were, alone, and her head is uncovered. Her name is written to the left of her head, looking from viewer left. You can barely make it out. She is Tekla, and of course we recognize in the middle is Paul, Paulos in Greek. He's seated and he's reading, I presume, from the Gospel. Maybe he has a copy of his own epistles. And next to him is Theoclia. You can see the name to the right, viewer right of her head. And that's the story of Tekla in the beginning of the Acts of Paul. There is a section called the Acts of Tekla. This is a 2nd century text. And what she does is, by the way, she's probably about 13, 14 years of age. She's first menses, and she decides to refuse to be handed over in normal Roman fashion from the power of her father to the power of her would-be husband. She says she is going to remain celibate. She's listened to Paul, and she's going to declare for celibacy. And that, of course, makes her not just a dissident within the family, but a dissident within the normalcy of Roman paterfamilias and paternal status. So she ends up in the arena. And the stories are every time she's in the arena, God defends her. And when Paul refuses to baptize her, lest she default, she decides to baptize herself, and God approves it. And by the way, not only do the women all support her, but even the female animals, a lioness supports her. So we have a good example of early Christian femalism, not just feminism, but femalism. A young virgin teenager taking on the Roman Empire, as it were. Now, in the story, Theoclia, who's her mother, you can see she's veiled as a matron there, she refuses to support her daughter. So I don't know quite what's happening here when I first saw it. On the one hand, she is standing, I presume, and she's about the same height as Paul. Both their fingers, their right hands, are raised in the teaching gesture of Byzantine theology. So that would make her, it would seem, to be teaching authoritatively like Paul. But on the other hand, her hand has been scratched out, vandalized, and her eyes have been gouged out. And I wasn't quite certain when I saw that whether the person who did that knows the story, that she didn't support Thecla and wants to vandalize her accordingly. But besides, he has to vandalize her teaching hand, her teaching authority. So it fascinated me when I first saw it, and Jonathan, when he got in there as well later, we didn't get in together, to see it, is why did they vandalize her teaching hand? Or why indeed was she given an authoritative teaching hand almost on a par with Paul? All of that backstory prepares us for the saga of the covers of the book we finally wrote. It wasn't called Excavating Paul, we called it In Search of Paul, and was published in 2006. But here is a story about those covers. Both of us, Jonathan and myself, had been fascinated, as we said, by that combination of Paul and Thecla and their teaching hands. So we decided to put on the cover a picture adapted from it. We had Paul standing up fully, and we had Theoclia standing up fully beside him as a male apostle and a female apostle, teaching with equal authority. That, we thought, explained what we meant by the book when we talked about, as Paul did, neither male nor female, refusing hierarchy, not difference, but hierarchy, and emphasizing Paul, 1 Corinthians 7, when he insisted that husband and wife, wife and husband, were of equal authority. So, that's what we imagined and asked our editors to have their art department draw up. But when it was taken to New York for approval, somebody in the meeting asked, we were later told, if this book is about Paul, what's that woman doing and who is she in any case? So in counter-proposal, they came up with the second draft, the one on viewer right, which has Paul right in the middle and pushed the woman almost off to the side and the darkness, so she was hardly even visible. All right, what happened next was our editors in San Francisco, after the discussion in New York, sent the new draft of the cover to Jonathan and myself. Now, allow for the difference that by then I was retired from DePaul. I was Professor Emeritus, which is Latin and means you get to live in Florida on the East Coast. Jonathan And our editors, of course, were on the West Coast, Jonathan in LA, and they were in San Francisco. So I open my email in the morning and I get this. And I kind of scream quietly internally. And externally, I wrote an immediate email to my editors. No, 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 no. You've completely countered the point of our book. You've made the female irrelevant or marginalized. And I sent it off. Now remember, they were operating 3 hours behind. So is Jonathan. Jonathan gets his email, opens it, and thinks, thank you very much, Jonathan, that I have come up with some kind of a brilliant idea that we put Paul in the middle and we make the viewer, the reader, the modern viewer, the modern reader, decide, where are you on a female apostle? Are you pushing her on or pushing her off? We knew, of course, that Paul had talked about a female apostle, so he would have had no problem with it in Romans 16. So Jonathan thought this was a marvelous one. And as soon as I got Jonathan's email, I thought, I never thought of that, but that is brilliant. It forces our reader, our modern reader, to decide, what would you do with a female apostle? Would you push her off the cover into the darkness, as it were? Or would you insist on bringing her back on? So, long story short, that was the cover. That's the cover in 2006 of our book, In Search of Paul. This is the fourth of the 5 major projects that occupied me in that time span from the 1970s to the 2020s. And it's one of the ones that happened after I had taken early retirement from DePaul in 1995. I was only 61, but the reason I took early retirement was that I loved teaching undergraduates. Actually, that was not the problem. But I was being invited to come and speak in churches on the weekend, to give a lecture, say, on Friday night, a couple of lectures on Saturday, and very often even to preach on Sunday. And I couldn't do both. I couldn't teach during the week at DePaul University and then go to churches on Sunday. And I realized there was something new happening in the country, that I was being invited to churches and asked to preach, because generally speaking, people thought I was much too liberal to be doing anything like that. But in any case, I took early retirement, and here was one other major project that I undertook afterwards. It concerns David and Debo, his wife, Dykes, who had their own foundation. You can find it if you want to see it at Faith and Reason. That's all one word, faithandreason.org. So they were very well equipped in technology and in production, and they came up with the idea of doing 2 series. One series would be called The Challenge of Jesus. The second would be called The Challenge of Paul. And each of them would be done in an NPR studio in front of a green screen. That meant that I could talk whatever I wanted to say, and I had to imagine what images would be put behind me on the screen, as if I was doing a weather announcement, and you had to imagine that I was seeing the weather scans behind me. To be honest with you, it was the most difficult thing I ever did, because I didn't have any type of teleprompter or video prompter, and while I had no trouble doing a lecture, straight lecture, even of an hour without notes, from an outline in my head, in this case I had to imagine, say, 20 or 30 or even 40 images and speak as if I was imagining the storyboard for a movie or something like that. But in any case, the Challenge of Jesus was taped on, as you can see, December the 12th and January the 1st in 2009 and 2010. And that's a shot of me in front of the green screen. And that time it was only from the waist up. The second one, taped in 2013, The Challenge of Paul, the full green screen came out, so I was standing on it as well, so the image could flood behind me and I didn't look like I had no body from the waist down. But I loved doing it. It was new technology, it was a new experience, and we did and published the Challenge of Jesus, Challenge of Paul, and I would very much encourage you to go to their website, as I repeat, faithandreason, all one word, .org, and you can see what we produced. Here are a few more details on those two series. If you look, for example, at the first one, the Challenge of Jesus, it had 4 major themes: the world of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. And each of those themes had 4 sessions. So you had about 16 hours in all, and with a prologue and an epilogue, maybe a little shorter, half-hour apiece. You have between 17 and 18 hours of lecturing. And they were, as I said, image-based, because while I'm talking, the image appears behind me about which I am discussing. And the same parallel process was used for the Challenge of Paul, except, as I said, I all of a sudden had delivered a lower body to myself. So 4 themes: Paul and Jesus, Paul and Luke, Paul and justice, Paul and God, each theme with 4 sessions, a short prologue and epilogue, so around 17 to 18 hours. And in general, I was extremely pleased with the production, because it moved from straight talk, from the ascendancy of the word to the ascendancy of the image. And I thought that everyone learned better when you had both a visual and an oral register. You learned better with both of them. I was very much aware, for example, that when I was watching advertisements on TV from the pharmaceutical industry, they might be saying the most awful things about the medication they were discussing, but all the people were shown happily romping at home or on the beach or in the park. So clearly you could see that the ascendancy of the image overdid the terrible warnings of what might happen from the medication. So in any case, I was getting more and more interested and involved in visual and not just oral or scribal registers. I turn now to the 5th and the final major project of those years, those long years between the 1970s and the 2020s. Look at the picture and the location. We are on one of those boats that ply the Bosphorus from the Galata Bridge all the way up to the mouth of the Black Sea. What are we doing there? That's what we're going to talk about. First of all, who are the people? Going from viewer left to viewer right. Viewer left, we begin with Marianne Borg, an Episcopal priest, a canon, and the founding director of the Center for Spiritual Development at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Portland, Oregon. Next to her, of course, is myself. Then in the middle is Haluk Çetinkaya, a Turkish Byzantine archaeologist and historian, professor at Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University in Istanbul. Next to Haluk is Sarah, my beloved wife. We were married on the 6th of August, 1986. Rather easy to remember that date. And Sarah is the official photographer and eventually videographer for all of these trips. By the time she was finished, we would have almost half a terabyte of images from all the trips that began in 2000. On the extreme right, Marcus Borg, husband of Marianne. Then that year, still the Honorary Distinguished Professor at Oregon State University in Corvallis, but sadly, unfortunately, he was taken from us both too young and too swiftly on the 21st of January in 2015. So, what are the five of us doing there? Back up to the year 2000. And this is important because it really was earlier than those two preceding projects and foundational for them. Marianne and Marcus invited Sarah and myself, would we like to become co-leaders with them on annual pilgrimages around Turkey in search of Paul, going not only to the places where he had been, like say Tarsus or Ephesus, but also to places, or even especially the places, he might never have been, but we could see very clearly because of excavations in process or because no town had been built on top of them, we could see very clearly what his Roman world was like. I'm thinking of places like Priene and Aphrodisias. So that was the invitation, and we said, of course, we would love to do it. All right. The first year, 2000, we tried to do Greece and Turkey, at least Western Turkey, and we totally exhausted ourselves. And we said, oh, and everyone else, of course, we're not going to try that again. So for the year 2001, please note the date, for the year 2001, we were all set on September the 19th to take 2 weeks in Turkey with about 40 people in search of Paul. Needless to tell you that 9/19 did not work after 9/11. So before we really got going, it was 2002. Now here's what was important. Very often in the first day when we got there and we talked to our, say, 30 or 40 pilgrims, and they'd pretty much admit, look, we're not sure we like this guy Paul, but we're coming with you people, and we figure if you can't find some redeeming social influence in him, we might as well give up. So we're here kind of to be with you to see what happens. Now, what happened was quite extraordinary. We were actually looking at Paul together in the ruins of the Roman Empire. We were not doing it just like in a church with his letters. We were thinking about Paul with the ruins of the Roman Empire all around us. And we watched what happened to ourselves too, as leaders, by the way, and to the people. We watched the change. Marcus one time said to me, are we getting better at this? And I said, nope, we're not getting better. It's just the situation is getting very, very clear. When we were watching Paul in the ruins of the Roman Empire and not the debates of the Reformation, people began to see what made Paul tick. And although we had people from Canada, Australia and New Zealand, we were predominantly Americans. And after 9/11, watching Paul in the ruins of one great empire made him come alive, especially to us Americans, in a way that had never happened in a church or while studying the New Testament or his own letters. Everything changed. Paul became Paul. I am showing this photograph for two reasons. First of all, it is one of the best, earliest ones we have of the whole group, and it was also taken at a place called Goreme in Cappadocia. But as you can see, it was taken in 2007, and I really want to talk about Goreme in Cappadocia in 2002. This, however, as I said, is one of the best shots we have of our whole group, and right above the center, you see that opening there, slightly to the left of the center of the photograph. You can ignore the hot air balloons, which are one of the features of Cappadocia. That's what I want to talk about. But this is our group at Goreme. Now, wait a minute. Aren't we supposed to be in search of Paul? What are we doing here? Yes, we are in search of Paul and Pauline sites, but it would be a cultural crime to bypass certain Byzantine sites, even though they're 1,000 years after Paul, and we're not claiming Paul was ever near any of these places. So what happened actually on the morning of, let me think, the date was Thursday, September the 19th in 2002. We almost came the same time as we had planned in 2001. We left Ankara. We were there for the Temple of Roman Augustus and the Great Museum of Anatolian Civilizations. We got in our tour bus and we're heading down south all the way to Tarsus actually, but we're passing through Cappadocia, and Cappadocia is one of the Earth's rather strange places. There are two volcanoes which spewed out lava, of course, and created pinnacles of rock which time and wind eroded in various ways to leave like standing almost mushrooms, tall thin mushrooms. But that lava was very easy to carve into. So you have houses carved into it, you have churches and basilicas carved into it, and you even have small towns carved into the tufa, rather like you find, say, with the catacombs in Rome. It's rather easy. I use that without any experience in doing it. Rather easy to carve and usually doesn't crack and fall in on you too often. Anyway, we're going to stop at Goreme, which is like a amphitheater of lava, and in it were built, as I said, churches, little almost miniature Byzantine basilicas. And we're going to watch one in particular. We have here a close-up of those openings seen above our head in the preceding photograph. It is a monastery actually, and inside is what is called the Dark Church. It's the monastic church actually. The small miniature basilica is the best way to describe it. The Byzantine basilica carved of course inside the tufa. It's called the Dark Church, by the way, because it was totally closed off. No light was getting in, so the frescoes inside are probably the best preserved in the entire Goreme Open Air Museum. And that's where we're going next. But in the meanwhile, you remember we were a big group, and of course lots of other busloads come, and they all leave big groups waiting. So we can only get into any of these places maybe 8 to 10 people at a time, then you have to wait for your turn. So you have a lot of time outside and you spend it kind of reading the explanations of what you're going to see inside, which are set up in 4 languages, English, French, German and Turkish. And when I'm waiting there, just passing the time, I'm reading it. And I'm surprised, just mildly surprised, because after Cappadocia, kind of nothing surprises you in Cappadocia. The strange lunar landscape is strange enough in any case. But I noticed that it tells us the frescoes we're going to see, and they're the typical ones of the life of Jesus. But where you would have expected to see resurrection, you find the Greek term, this is in the English, anastasis. I'm mildly curious, just why did we suddenly go to the Greek term when we would expect resurrection? I was only wondering about it because I had nothing else to do while I was waiting to get in. When we finally get inside, this is what we see. And what is marvelous, of course, about being inside the Byzantine tradition is you are inside the story. As you look all around you, what you're seeing, for example, in this case, is the life of Christ. You are inside the story. You're not being told about it. But here's the strange thing, and continues what happened outside. If you look up towards the right top corner, you can probably recognize that that is Doubting Thomas. He's reaching out to touch the risen Christ up in the top right-hand corner. Then coming down towards the right, you would recognize, of course, the crucifixion, and as you looked all around, all of us recognize every picture that we see, except look to the left of the crucifixion. There's something there that was very unusual. That's more or less we would expect to be something like the resurrection. Now, we all know from churches in the West what the resurrection is supposed to look like. Jesus is seen coming out, stepping out, or out of his tomb. He is magnificent, he is glorious, he is triumphant, but he's absolutely alone, and the only other ones there are the guarding soldiers, who are either sleeping and or looking. According to the story in Matthew, they had seen the resurrection, but were suborned by perjury to swear that they had been asleep and seen nothing. So we know what it looks like. Jesus is supposed to be arising all by himself alone, and that is not at all what we're seeing in this image. Here is that image in a close-up, and somebody has quite conveniently also named it in case we might get lost and not recognize it. In the center, of course, is Christ, and notice, for example, that he has a cruciform halo and that he's also carrying a cross. It's not the great big wooden cross, it's the Byzantine processional cross, but he is clearly stressed as the crucified one. You're not allowed to forget that he is the crucified one. What's he doing? Well, first of all, he is standing on top of another figure. That's good old Hades. He's kind of old and kind of powerful, but he's now manacled. So this is Christ descending into Hades. And what's he doing? Well, look also, by the way, over at the gates of Hades. The two of them are flattened and the bolts and bars are flying in all directions. And the gates are set again in cruciform position. So again, you're not allowed to forget this is the executed one, the crucified one. What's he doing? Well, as you can see, he's moving forcibly to viewer right, and his right arm, his left arm holds that cross, his right arm, grasps the wrist of Adam. Again, in case you don't know who that is, to the right of his halo, to viewing right of his halo, it says Adam, and behind him is Eve, and it's a little bit strange iconography whether she's waiting her turn after Adam or she's out of her sepulchre before him, but in either case Christ is taking Adam and Eve out of their sepulchres, yanking them out of their sepulchres. Over on the other side, again with names in case you don't know, bearded and crowned is David, and his son, not bearded and crowned, Solomon. So what strikes you immediately is this is Christ not rising alone. And by the way, in case you have any doubt what you're looking at, above his head it says quite clearly in Greek, the anastasis, the holy anastasis. This is why, of course, the word outside is resurrection, is not resurrection, but anastasis, because the word inside, on the very fresco itself, says this is the anastasis, this is the resurrection. So put it bluntly, dear Western Christians, if you have a different image of the resurrection, that's your problem. This is Eastern Christianity, this is Byzantine Christianity, and this is our image. The liberation, the resurrection of the whole human race. Adam and Eve, of course, representing in biblical genealogy, as it were, the human race. This is the whole human race being liberated by Easter. And that leaves us a lot to think about. So now, that day, I didn't have much time to think about it. I really didn't. But what did happen was this. Every night on our pilgrimage, before we spent about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, say from 6 to 7:30 before dinner. Mary Ann would introduce it with prayer and reading from Paul. Then Marcus and I would each take half an hour to speak about Paul. And before we started, when we were emailing one another and what we were going to do, Marcus said, how will we avoid not saying the same thing? So he said, well, I have about a dozen lectures on Paul and I'll just work my way through them. And I said, great, then what I'll try and do is each evening I'll try and tie into Paul what we've seen that day. So now, how on earth am I going to connect this to Paul? It was fine when I was talking about Pauline's Roman sites. So I had to start thinking, and I mean thinking. This is Eastern Christianity. It's not the same resurrection as Western Christianity. So I'm going to talk tonight, and other nights too, about 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul and the resurrection. And I'm going to be asking, and asking myself as much as anyone, if Paul were to see this image and see also a Western image, which would he accept as the proper image for Easter? And my sense was that being an Easterner himself, he'd be more at home with Goreme than he might be with our Western ones. But that's all only starting that day. I've even said more than I saw already. But that's where something started. And it was a huge, really 20-year project. On that pilgrimage in 2002, if we had only seen that example of Easter and the resurrection as viewed in Eastern Christianity, where Christ liberates the human race from death, from the prison house of death. That's where Hades is. Hades, of course, is simply the guardian of death. He's not hell. This is not what the West calls the harrowing of hell. That's simply the Western response to the East when it doesn't know what to do with it. It's the liberation of the human race from what you might call corporate death, the liberation of our species from doom. If we only had it in Goreme, maybe we might have thought, well, everything's strange in Cappadocia, so this is strange too. But by the end of our tour that year, we ended up, of course, in Istanbul, and we went to the magnificent Church of the Holy Saviour in Kora. In Kora simply means it was outside originally the first gate, the first walls of Istanbul, so it was in the countryside, as it were, in Kora. And it was obviously a basilica, Byzantine basilica, which then became a mosque, and eventually today is a museum. It dates from, as you can see the dates there, from the 1300s. And we were there on Tuesday, October the 1st in 2002. And it's the image inside that which is probably, without doubt, the most magnificent image of the anastasis in all of Byzantine Christianity. Here is that magnificent image cut out from the surrounding walls of the mortuary chapel. Obviously, once again, you can see the Greek above the head, He Anastasis. This is the resurrection. It's exactly the resurrection of Eastern Christianity. Christ is again robed magnificently. He is standing on the gates of Hades, and again, down there you can barely see him, is Hades all trussed up. I repeat again, this is not Satan, this is not hell, this is Hades, the place of death, and we're talking about the death of the human race and what might save the death of the human race. How the non-violent Jesus, the Jesus who was crucified and executed for non-violent resistance to violent injustice, how such a program, the program of non-violent resistance, which alone does not escalate what it opposes, might save our human species. Anyway, you can see again the locks and bolts of Hades are flying off in all directions. And this is I much prefer it to the preceding one because this is like an equal opportunity anastasis. Adam and Eve, Adam to viewer left, of course, Eve to viewer right, each get a hand from Christ, an equal opportunity resurrection, as I said. They're being yanked out of their tomb. This is the human race being liberated with Christ. And from either side, looking on, to viewer left, you have John the Baptist. He kind of looks like he needs a shave and a haircut. Then the two kings, the unbearded, not bearded, but crowned Solomon, the bearded and crowned his father David. Then over on the other side, corresponding to John the Baptist as the first martyr of the New Testament is Abel. You can see him carrying his staff as a shepherd, martyred by Cain. So the two first martyrs, as it were, of Old and New Testament face one another. And then behind him are other, presumably prophets. They're not identified. You never get more than maybe 6 people identified in any of these. Adam and Eve, Abel and John the Baptist, and the two kings. But this is the most magnificent image of Eastern Christianity. And quite frankly, in the years that followed, we found it everywhere. Sarah and I went back many times by ourselves. Sometimes Marcus and Marianne and ourselves went a week before or after our pilgrimage, as long as we were over in Europe. We went all across Europe. I'm going to say from Spain to Syria, from Russia to Egypt, across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Crete to Cyprus, and everywhere we went, this is Eastern Christianity's Easter. And anyone who speaks of the Western tradition and doesn't know about this is speaking only with Western eyes and Western myopia, I would say. For example, Sarah and I went back to Cyprus twice, in 2012 and 2023. And we want to use this image from the Church of the All-Holy Mother of God in Galata, Cyprus. It dates from 1514 to kind of summarize all we were learning in those years. The reason we have both images side by side on the wall is that Cyprus, of course, was Eastern Christianity, so that's what you'd expect, the image on the left. But in the 16th century, and this church dates from 1514, the Venetians had taken over Cyprus. The Western Venetians, or the Westerners, Venetians, had taken over Cyprus and imported also their Western image of Easter. So we happen to have them side by side on the same wall in the same church. Now look at them. First of all, both of them say, "Hey, Anastasis." They're both called the resurrection. Look now and they both say Jesus Christ in abbreviations on either side of Jesus' head, in case you wouldn't know, as it were. And in both cases, Jesus is carrying in his left hand, left arm, the cross, the liturgical Byzantine cross, once again not the great big heavy wooden cross. Also in both cases his halo is cruciform. So again you're reminded again and again, this is the crucified one, the executed one who liberates the human race. Look at his arms, you can see the wounds. You can see the wounds in his feet and in his arms, especially looking at the left, he is standing on the gates of Hades, bolts and bars all around. There is no image of Hades himself, but he's standing on the cruciform gates of Hades. One other reminder that he is the executed one. You can see the wounds on his feet and his hand. He's reaching out, again, as you expect, to Adam, and grasps him by the limp wrist. He's raising him out. The early one we saw was leading him out, the one in Goremi. Now he's raising him up, preliminary to lead him out. Behind him is Eve. Eve's in red quite often. Adam tends to be very old. Eve tends to be young and beautiful because she's the mother of the human race. She's ageless, as it were. To viewer left, behind Jesus is is John the Baptist. Above the heads of David to left, bearded and crowned. Solomon to right, not bearded and crowned. So I think that's pretty much the one to the left. That's the universal resurrection. I call it universal because it takes Adam and Eve, that is the human race. That's the universal resurrection of Eastern Christianity. Now shift over to the viewer right. Again, we looked at all the similarities, but you see the difference, of course. Jesus is stepping out, one leg in, one leg out, as it were, of his sepulchre. And in both cases, the earth is opening up. You can see to the left and to the right, the earth opens up to let him out, as it were. But he's alone. While it's universal to left, it's individual for Jesus alone to right. You couldn't have a better illustration of the similarities and differences. Down below, with their faces vandalized, I suppose by some pious pilgrim with some anger, the guards who will either see the resurrection and deny it or will sleep. And there you have the two of them. So basically what we are doing across almost 20 years was going everywhere, as I said, to see and to certify for ourselves this is definitely the West and the East, and they're quite different, and that raises huge issues for theology and for iconography. And if the West doesn't raise it, it is simply their ignorance of the East. I conclude this fourth part of my academic autobiography with this cover from our book Resurrecting Easter, How the West Lost and the East Kept the Original Easter Vision. It was published by Sarah and myself in 2018. And I have great gratitude. We have both great gratitude to our publishers and our editors at Harper One in San Francisco, because it is a magnificent book. Instead of keeping the 4 color images all tucked away at the back, which would be much cheaper, they are spread out through the entire book, keeping the text about them and the images more or less as close as possible. For example, there's images on almost every page. And those images include ones that we ourselves took, that is, that Sarah took, in mosaics, frescoes, icons, in either museums or churches, but also a large amount of manuscripts which you had to purchase, say, from the Vatican or any of the great museums of Europe. If you are interested, my strong advice is not to try and get the book, which may well be difficult to get because it's so expensive, but get a Kindle version and attach whatever you have, be it your cell phone or a tablet, to the biggest computer you have around, or to a projection screen if you're looking at it, say, in the church. Any of those images will sustain high resolution display. And look at it on the biggest display you can get, and take your time, because it raises huge issues about Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, and whether a total focus on the West is simply a bad habit. In any case, the book raises and leaves behind it these questions. Why are there 2 radically divergent visions of Easter Sunday? The individual one in the West and the universal one in the East. Jesus alone in the West, Jesus and the human race, Adam and Eve, in the East? Second question, which is and which is not in better continuity and closer conformity to Paul's vision in 1 Corinthians 15? For example, if those pesky Corinthians said to Paul, you know, you're always talking about crucifixion. Yeah, we know about that. We've seen that. But what about this resurrection business? Could you draw us a picture of that, please? Could you draw us what you meant when you were a Pharisee and now you're a Messianic Christian? What do you mean by resurrection? And if Paul had drawn it, would it look more or less like an Eastern image of the whole human race arising with Jesus? Or would it look like the Western one of Jesus alone? And then the final question, the great question for the future of theology. What was the challenge of those dual Easter images? Do you accept one or the other, or in some way must it be combined together for the future? What is the relevance? Is there any relevance of Easter today? Does that vision of the liberation of the whole human race by non-violent resistance, has that some relevance for the sustainability of our species now? Those are the questions I leave from my academic autobiography.